Let's start our talk then. I will introduce myself first. I am Olena Hrajdan, the journalist and the editor at Ukraine's business media, The Page. We write about economics and business in Ukraine, especially the small and medium-sized business, as well as this also macroeconomics and finance that I cover as a journalist. Then we're currently talking to Дженніфер Брік Муртазашвілі, who is a scientist at University of Pittsburgh, and she studies the recovery processes. Especially her expertise lies in the history of Afghanistan and its post-war recovery, and what other lessons can we learn from the recovery as a process overall, as well as from what can we learn from Afghanistan. So, Jennifer, you study reconstruction as a process, as a whole process. And one may think that this is only a process of the actual rebuilding of walls, factories, premises, and housing. But your research shows that it's more than that. Can you define what's opposed to reconstruction as a concept that you study?
Sure. I think actually this is a very good question, and one that we often forget to ask or even think about, even as people who work in this field. But I think of reconstruction less about the buildings and the schools and the things that we think about of rebuilding, but mostly important, the political and the economic institutions that facilitate long-term reconstruction. And often during this period of destabilization that happens during war, there's so much destabilization that there's some positive things that happen because of it. It allows people to rethink political order, rethink the nature of domestic political institutions, and to help rebuild those things so that countries don't face this issue for the future. So that's where there's a focus more on the political and economic institutions that facilitate the reconstruction. Now, Ukraine is a very different case, actually. I've been thinking a lot about this since my trip in September, is that normally when we are engaged in post-conflict reconstruction, it happens during a civil war, after a civil conflict. And in most cases, it is the domestic political institutions of that country that facilitated the conflict to begin with. The people are fighting because something wasn't right. There wasn't an ability of people to participate. Often it is dictators who have civil conflict because they repress populations. So most reconstruction takes place after that period. And so this political restructuring is a very, very important part of most reconstruction efforts. Now, two countries that were not a civil conflict that had reconstruction in recent memory were Japan and Germany after World War II. But once again, those countries were seen as aggressors, and they were occupied by international forces. So the international community restructured like Japan and Germany's political institutions as a central part of reconstruction. So I actually think Ukraine is a very, very unique case in world history where we're seeing huge reconstruction efforts, but not political destabilization.
Yes, this is my following question, because I remember that you mentioned the countries that undergone post-war reconstruction, and those were like post-war reconstruction after civil wars or after natural disasters. If we say Turkey, for example. And Ukraine is indeed a unique case because it has neither a civil war nor an unstable government. I would say quite the opposite. Especially when we're talking about the government, it's quite the opposite, since the government stayed after Russia invaded Ukraine. What international experience can we apply then if nothing fits?
So there are some very important lessons.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is what we call rentier state, or rentier, R-E-N-T-I-E-R. It's a French word, so I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And basically what this means is that when a government is able to operate on resources that are not generated from productive sources in the economy. This means like oil revenue or international aid. When the government's able to function without actually having to depend on the people for taxes, it creates a huge incentive problem that facilitates corruption. Okay?
Mhm.
So this is any country. This doesn't, this is any country in the world. When you start having, and any individual this could apply to, if all of a sudden you start getting lots of grants and you don't have to think about your performance, you just get the grants, and you can be very careless in the way that you spend that money. If you get inheritance, right? Often people who inherit money, they don't have to think about where the money came from. So they are more careless with this money than if they had to earn this money themselves. We see this a lot. In fact, in economics, they talk about the IKEA effect, right? If you build the furniture yourself, you value that furniture much more than if someone gave it to you or if you buy it. That's why people value this very inexpensive furniture from IKEA, because they built it. So this rentier effect means that a potential risk to Ukraine is corruption that comes from the huge influx of external funding. And I think this is a very real threat that is not unique to Ukraine. It's not saying that Ukrainians are corrupt or the government is corrupt. It is a normal phenomena when a country has huge amounts of aid money come in or oil resources, right? We see this in a lot of oil wealthy states, huge amounts of corruption. So that is the concern. So the other concern I have actually about this aid resources that are coming in is that international community tends to build parallel structures, right? Rather than going through the government, they don't trust the government for some reason. Of course, people have read all these reports about corruption in the Ukrainian government. Can the Ukrainian government handle all of the resources that are coming? Will it be too much? Will it break the capacity of the government? So what the international community often does is it sets up these parallel bodies to administer aid. And so when it does that, it can actually undermine local governments in the region. The international community is often very bad at targeting the people who need assistance the most, because they don't have good information, and they often get captured by a few people who have good connections to them. I've seen this a lot, so they'll have 2 or 3 staff members who can direct hundreds of millions of dollars, right? And those could be local or international. So often it is the case that you could have a governance program that's funded by USAID, for example, that has $150 million in Lviv, just for example, and that's bigger than the government budget in Lviv. So when aid is done through donors and through NGOs or their own NGOs, it can actually undermine people's trust in governments. It can lead to a lot of other problems.
Then if we have switched to the question of distrust, I suppose we can dig it even further. You have mentioned, we will refer to the case of Afghanistan here and there, because despite the fact that the two states seem to be alike, they are still different, but we have some common lessons to learn from. One of the reasons for the failure in Afghanistan that led to Taliban rise was that the international corporate international institutions, they didn't transfer their knowledge to the local level. Sometimes they neglected local needs. For example, they build a huge road but haven't spoken to the local businesses that wanted to work closer to the road, and they didn't connect with each other. What do you think should be done to prevent this?
So the reason this wasn't done is because of a structural issue with the Afghan government, in my opinion. After 2001, when the US came into Afghanistan, it went on this reconstruction effort. It helped Afghanistan create a new constitution and become a democracy. And yes, there were elections at the national level, but in Afghanistan, there were never elections for officials at the subnational level. There was never an elected governor. There was never an elected city council. There was never an elected hromada. Okay? So there was, all officials were appointed by the central government at the national level, at the local level, at the village level. Everyone was appointed by the center. So it meant when the international community like the US came in to build a road, it just had to deal with the national government because there was no local government. Okay? So of course they said, yes, we gathered the community leaders, we gathered the elders, we talked about it. But talking about this with people when you have so much power and they don't, doesn't really mean anything, right? It doesn't mean anything. I find this when especially donors talk about international, community consultation. Oh, the only community consultation that matters is elections and democracies. Have elections, allow people to decide this, or allow elected officials to decide. But if you don't have local democracy, you're never going to have good local information. So this was a huge problem that really makes Afghanistan very, very different from Ukraine. So what I saw over many years in Afghanistan was, and in Tajikistan as well, where I spent a lot of time, they had a civil war, and I looked at reconstruction issues there as well, is heavily centralized governments. And people at the local level had no voice in how things were done. And so to get around this, the donors would come and say, oh, we met with the community leaders, we sat them in a circle, we had deliberative process, NGOs were leading this. And it sounds lovely, but in fact, I just don't think it's possible to have real meaningful participation like this unless it's through a formal government body. When you're dealing with donors, when you're dealing with someone who can make this kind of decision with you, right?
I remember at Kiev School of Economics, you mentioned the decentralization reform, and you said that it might be the key to success so that the reconstruction in Ukraine will be a successful case and not the other way around. Can you elaborate?
Absolutely. So just as I discussed how Afghanistan suffered because of this issue. Why did the Taliban become so popular? Because people didn't have a voice. And they had all of these, as Ukraine's own history knows, often these governors are appointed, God knows where they come from, right? God knows what they do throughout Ukraine's, even post-independence period, they take money. People saw this. And it happened a lot in Afghanistan. There was so much money coming in, and people couldn't hold these leaders accountable for anything. Okay. And they felt very frustrated, and they felt like, why is the international community not listening to us? Right? Oh no, we're having consultative meetings. No, this doesn't count. So what does Ukraine have? It has the real meaningful decentralization. And so that means that reconstruction can go through local bodies who have capacity to make decisions on behalf of people. So at the Hromada level, I think a lot of reconstruction assistance can go through them. But this is also very inconvenient for governments too, right? So when you have a government who's working during periods of war, they want to move things quickly, right? There's pressure, rebuild quickly, show things quickly. And local governments that are elected are often slow. The national government will say they're maybe incompetent. They're not technically sophisticated as the central government officials. So there's this desire then to strip local governments of power and have reconstruction go through the center because it's faster. They can achieve results faster. They can just tell the locals what to do and it'll go faster. And in fact, when I was in Kiev, I heard this many times, that there's debates happening right now about changing the role of local governments for reconstruction. And on the one hand, there could be some positive aspects. It could allow the government to do things quicker, but faster isn't always better. And what matters for reconstruction actually isn't the building of the school. It's people feeling that they were part of this, and that the money for the school wasn't wasted. It was done with the people, for the people, by the people. And this seems to matter more than the actual reconstruction itself. The reconstruction is a process. It is not an outcome.
I see. Well, then who should define how it how everything will be reconstructed, donors, hromadas, or other bodies, and how to achieve this feeling of the fact that like the money wasn't wasted.
I think this is up to the people of Ukraine. It cannot be coming from the donors. Absolutely not. The donors will want to say, of course, but it has to come from the people of Ukraine, who will have very strong opinions of this, and there has to be a debate. You know, maybe some people in the Hromadas feel, we don't have the capacity to do this. We are moving slow. Our people are suffering from trauma. We don't have the technical skills. Maybe there's someone we can rely upon for help. But that has to be part of a debate. And that debate, that everyone feels that they have a seat at the table during the debate, is very, very important. But the people of Ukraine, there is no one way that is the right way. What matters most is that the people themselves have an opportunity to participate in this discussion.
So do you think that the states should not only like be the only one subject in this discussion? What do you think about the role of businesses, communities, NGOs, and others?
Private sector is huge, and they're often not consulted enough. Often what happens during Reconstruction, NGOs play an important role, but NGOs, as we know, operate like businesses, right? So NGOs become strengthened during times of Reconstruction because they become another vehicle to deliver aid. And we typically think of NGOs as advocacy organizations, right? But that's not their function during Reconstruction. At least recently, they are not advocacy organizations, they're service delivery organizations. They're executing Reconstruction efforts, right? We normally, nonprofits, NGOs can have several roles, you know, gathering people together to do things, to organize things, to advocate on behalf of disabled people, women, children, like this, or they can be service delivery organizations.
And what service will they deliver then?
Well, oftentimes they are very much involved in Reconstruction efforts. They are actually the ones who are building things, NGOs. They will contract with private firms to do this, but often contracts go to NGOs for social services support. Right? So NGOs then become also rentier dynamics. Look at the role of NGOs in post-war Ukraine. Right? There's probably a lot of them. You can tell me the story, you know far better than I do. And many of them have a lot of money now.
Oh, much like they have more money than before the war, but yeah, they are only, from what I can tell, they only realize their role. For example, I have a lot of friends in Ukraine's NGO, Rebuild Ukraine. And I know its head, and he started this organization after, well, about half a year after the invasion. And he is now talking to donors and to other organizations. And he only says, like, Helen, we're just figuring this out. We're just trying to understand how to build this algorithm because it's just the start. So it's kind of like in an early stage of development. But anyway, I got you. Then you have also mentioned that we have a government in a country with an ongoing war. So it hasn't stopped, and we have some forecasts of Ukraine's intelligence. We have some expectations of the business or the government, but basically no one in the world knows when will this war end, which is again quite close to Afghanistan, because the reconstruction, it started when they were still having these fightings. Now, can you say how is it possible to reconstruct a country that is still in an ongoing war?
So I think there's two ways in Ukraine to think about this. The first is there is the deoccupied territories that were badly damaged. So for example, I visited Irpin and Bucha and those areas, Hostomel, to the north, and you can see that there's still a lot of damage to the physical structure, and there's a lot of social damage as well. And the role of the local administration in this reconstruction effort, I think, has been very important. So it was very surprising to me to see how quickly those areas have rebuilt. And on the physical side, there's still a lot of work to be done, however, right? It's only the very beginning. And so I think there are parts of the country, you know, not just in the deoccupied territories, but there are still these attacks that happen almost daily, you know, coming from Russia. Infrastructure has to be rebuilt, the power source has to be rebuilt, but then there's also the political infrastructure. So, you know, one part of the reconstruction effort that leaves me very optimistic about Ukraine is that Ukraine has a goal, and that is EU accession, the desire to join the EU. So that is a political reconstruction effort that's happening alongside the physical reconstruction effort. So there are some hopes and desires to re-engineer some of the political and economic institutions to align them with EU standards, and the hopes that Ukraine can later join the EU. And that's happening at the same time the country's fighting a war and trying to physically rebuild. And to my mind, that institutional reconstruction or rehabilitation is a very important part of the future, and it will align Ukraine's goals going forward. And this desire to join the EU makes Ukraine create a certain kind of political institution that will protect it from the kinds of corruption, the kinds of civil conflict that other countries face in the future, I hope.
Mm-hmm. I can say that you have read the overall situation quite clearly, because I'm a Kiev-born citizen that has been living in Irpin for 20 years. So I have known the city far before it became mainstream, and I can say that, yes, there's still a lot of work to do, but the speed of recovery is faster than what I expected. Because I remember when my parents returned to a family home in the middle of spring or in later spring, and then we have like autumn or winter when like the windows are being repaired and all these tiny stuff are being done. So you got it right.
But on the other hand, you know, I can't imagine what it has been like for you to see all of this. It was very painful for me to see. I just can't imagine. So I'm just so sorry for this. But one of the things that left me with a lot of hope from seeing Irpin especially was in many other countries that I visited, you know, even Afghanistan amongst many others, is that when there's reconstruction, the international community is often the face of this. And what I noticed in Irpin is that very little footprint of internationals. Yes, you'll see some logos on something, but everything is led by the local government. And unlike other countries that have gone through post-conflict reconstruction, like Afghanistan, for example, or many others that had UN peacekeeping troops or NATO forces, here in Ukraine, there's not this. It is all local institutions, all locally led. So you do not have this tension. It doesn't feel that someone else is doing this. And to me, that is really, really important. And I left Ukraine. I knew that Ukraine had these strong institutions. I'd been to Ukraine before, but to see it during the war and to see it during the reconstruction actually left me very, very hopeful.
I want to speak on the speed of recovery, because there is like these things like expectations and reality, and it is something that we inside Ukraine discuss a lot. And then you also mentioned it, that sometimes there is a huge pressure on doing everything faster and faster and faster so that we can get the instant result. But on the other hand, some things may happen slower but bring more effectiveness, maybe less efficiency, but more effectiveness. Then how to find these, how to find the right speed, and how to explain, well, that like we can move with the reconstruction with this speed, and like there is no other way.
Well, I think in Ukraine, it's very hard because you're trying to rebuild while you're fighting. And I think the priority for most people is fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And people will be willing to accept slower reconstruction, I think, if they understand that the front lines is going well or there's progress being made. It's hard to do all of this at once, given the scope of the fighting, right? This is a
Mm-hmm.
huge war, a huge land war. So it's going to be very hard for Ukraine to do both. So it's the role of the leaders together with like the parliament, the elected officials to set expectations. But of course, people are very impatient. And if people
Mm-hmm.
see, look at all this money coming in, they're going to blame the president. And he'll become much more unpopular. And of course, he's very popular, remains very popular, but of course, he's not as popular as he was at the very beginning, right? And this is normal and this is natural. And he'll become only more unpopular as reconstruction continues, and he'll have to explain to people where his priorities are and hope that they agree. I think there is agreement, though, that the priority should be on the battlefield. You have to make choices.
Mm-hmm. And if we're looking at the same situation in a macro scale, because, for example, Ukrainian expert Irina Kosem, she also studied the issue of Afghanistan, because in Ukraine we have the Institute of Economic Development, and they are also having huge research on the recovery. They will have the platform the project where they will oversee the whole future recovery process. And she noticed that maybe when Afghanistan, after the recovery, when they tried to join the World Trade Organization and the UN, that it may have been too fast. And it also may have brought some consequences, because the country, again, we're talking about the speed. They were trying to speed up so much that they have lost this effectiveness of the recovery. So my question would be, do you think at a macro scale, is it important to skip some stages of development, go past them really fast, and not, because if you go very fast through these stages, you may, it can get worse rather than better.
Right.
How to find this balance?
I actually don't believe in the stages of development, right?
Uh-huh.
So, I don't think that there's this progress and that there's a linear path and you would do this and this. So I think what we've learned is that the countries are going to go in many different directions. But one thing I think what your colleagues are pointing out is, number one, if you do too much too fast, and especially ask the government to do too much too fast, we call this premature load bearing. You put too much weight on something, it'll fall down. So I think that is an issue. And I'm not sure in Afghanistan if this was the issue, because a lot of the aid didn't go through the government at all. And even when it did go through the government, it was actually let's send this rural reconstruction project to this Ministry of Rural Development. They transferred the money to the World Bank, but then the World Bank had 30 international NGOs implementing it on behalf of the government. So it wasn't really local bodies doing the implementation. There was lots of games like this where, oh no, it's a government program. And the villager would say, but why is this French woman implementing it? Right? No, it's your government. Well, I'm sorry, you're from France. Or why is a French NGO demarcating the lines of my village and deciding who gets to participate in a village council? So lots of issues like that. And then the World Bank or whatever would say and even the government would say, oh, we don't have the capacity. We're letting the internationals do this. And in Afghanistan, it was true the government didn't have much capacity, but there was also a game to this. A political game that many of my Afghan colleagues pointed out is that they loved having the international NGOs do the work because it gave the ministries great press, and they would always ask for more money.
Mhm.
And nobody would say, oh, Save the Children, they always need more money. And when Save the Children is talking about their great project and the impact they're having, it's a very cynical approach. My Afghan colleagues, I never would have thought of this, and I remember having this discussion. They say, our government's so clever. You think it's bad not having the NGOs do the work. I mean, having the NGOs do the work, but actually it's very clever on the part of the government. I never thought of this. So you can have the government do too much too fast. I don't think WTO accession was necessarily bad because that gave a very isolated country access to markets.
Mhm.
And to me, that kind of thing was very important in a very isolated, very landlocked country. But there are other things that are done too fast, too much too fast. But often they're not the right things. And often when you have citizen buy-in and people making the decisions alongside the government, you can avoid this.
Mhm. But it seems that joining the WTO hasn't really helped Afghanistan to build a market economy.
Well, it didn't hurt it, right? So
Mhm.
I would argue that Afghanistan, one of the sectors that actually did the best that we don't pay enough attention to is the business sector, the private sector. It didn't get any attention. But in many parts of the country where I was able to travel that didn't have active fighting, you could see private sector doing so much. People are very
Mhm.
entrepreneurial. They're very business oriented. Very, very quickly, they got running. They were used to very difficult circumstances, and you find such an entrepreneurial society. The problem was you had suicide bombings every day. You had such lack of predictability, so it became very hard for entrepreneurs to operate in this kind of environment. And plus, the aid economy was so large relative to the private sector that it really crowded out a lot of the private sector work.
Mhm. Then if we're switching to the private sector, I suppose that, well, I may leave this question here, may put this like when I will be editing to the issue of trust. But
And I have to go at the half hour. I'm sorry.
Okay. So we have, it's fine. It's fine. I have just a couple of questions, so we will be finishing very soon.
Sorry.
It's fine. So, but we still have like 30 minutes.
Yeah.
It's more.
No.
No.
We have eight minutes.
8 minutes. I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Okay.
Okay. I will have enough. The question about the relationships between international institutions and the private sector. The private sector, well, we will skip the international private sector that may come here with the investments. We're currently talking only about the Ukrainian private sector that will be taking part in procurements, projects, some other reconstruction initiatives. And what to do with this mistrust between the international agencies and the private sector? Because again, well, they may suspect some corruption. They may feel that the game is not fair enough. And is it possible to build this trust between the private sector and the international organizations?
This is where oversight is so important. Oversight is really important. This is the role that civil society should play. Right? Is this not so my concern is that the role of civil society becomes quite confused when they're both implementing and overseeing. And an effective I think that it shouldn't be NGOs that are doing this work. It should be the private sector that is implementing things, and it should be the NGOs and the civil society that oversee and investigate and make sure that there's no corruption. And a strong civil society is very important to this, and that the international community set the expectation that this is the role that civil society will play. But I think you create a lot of opportunities for corruption when you have civil society both as advocates and as implementers. So more oversight is better. We're having this debate. I think I mentioned it in my talk at Kyiv School of Economics about having a special inspector general for Ukraine reconstruction, which is a very politically sensitive issue in the United States. In the United States, it's only those politicians that are opposed to aid to Ukraine that have advocated for the creation of the special inspector general. And what I say is that let Ukraine have a special inspector general for reconstruction, because it only will help the people of Ukraine, because inevitably the international community will make mistakes and do things that are wrong. And the citizens of Ukraine can complain to their own government about actions that the government takes, but it cannot complain to anybody about what the international community does. This is where having the Special Inspector General will protect the interests of the people of Ukraine and also protect them against corruption. So this organization is very effective in investigating instances of corruption. So what I have argued here in the United States is very politically unpopular, especially amongst many of my friends who support, giving aid to Ukraine, is that we should have more oversight bodies. It's not because Ukrainians are bad or there's anything bad about Ukraine. We know that Ukraine has a history of corruption. We know the effect that aid has on corruption. Let us help Ukrainians protect themselves from us, the international community, and give them one more body that can protect them. So to me, this is more oversight is really important, and having a president and a leader that says, investigate, that you, the civil society, are the eyes on the ground, and we need more transparency in everything that's happening. That's the key.
Mm-hmm. I see. My last question will be, since we have discussed all the macro situation, the inside, the private sector, the NGOs, I suppose if we look at the Ukraine now, like when the stage of recovery has only started, even for the occupied territories in Kyiv Oblast, what do you think Ukrainians that are not that don't work in the state sector and private sector should keep in mind as a to-do list when the reconstruction has just started?
It's really hard for me to say as an outsider, but I would just say that we should encourage participation, voice, everyone talking, asking questions. There's such a spirit of this inside of Ukraine. I think that is what has made Ukraine so special in mobilizing for the war, this incredible spirit of local participation. Voluntarism, and that has to extend to the reconstruction. Reconstruction can't be seen as something that's given from someone to us to help us. It is done by us. This is what people need to remember, is it is their own reconstruction, not waiting for someone to do it, but them doing it themselves, communities doing it themselves. Even raising the money. If the government doesn't have the money, people find money to do things. There's incredible spirit of this inside of Ukraine. I've seen this. Even Timothy Brick, he started a group on this reconstruction. This is the spirit that will drive it, not waiting for someone else, but the spirit that is already inside of Ukraine to do it ourselves.
This is a great ending for this interview. I thank you for your time and for your expertise as well. And when we will edit everything, I will send you all the links. So for now, Jennifer, thank you very much. I hope we will see you in Kyiv once again, and we will be waiting for the future conversations.